Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Okayest Trapper Podcast, not Prodcast, brought to you by Mountain Tough Fitness. Check them out today and use the promo code OKS30, all caps, for a free 30-day trial. Now, today's guest is a true Renaissance man and jack of all trades. He grew up in South Central Minnesota, where his love for the outdoors was born, but eventually settled in North Dakota after finishing his education there. He now lives on 5 acres of a rural homestead with his partner and 3 daughters and juggles his regular day job centered around soil conservation, writing articles and books, trapping and tanning fur, and raising plants for all sorts of different purposes that I'm sure we'll get into. I am also glad to be able to call this gentleman a friend, a trapping mentor, Jeffrey Miller. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're excited to get rolling and have a conversation. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a little while now. Now I knew you grew up in Minnesota, and I'm assuming the outdoors were a huge part of your life. But can you recount the first memory of ever being on a trap line?
I sure can. Yeah. So South Central Minnesota, and in the mid 80s, my dad ran a short line. And I remember we were out trapping. Um, I think we were trapping raccoon, and I was probably 4 or 5, and it was November. It was pretty cold. It hadn't froze up yet, but it was cold. And we got to a little bit of a ditch, and I was in his arms, and he jumped across the ditch, and I slipped free and fell in the water. And I remember standing on the gravel road, getting dressed down so he could turn the heat on, and he was telling. So I didn't ever tell her that happened, but that was my first ever memory of trapping, was being in anything, because I wanted to go back the next.
And did you go back the next day and continue trapping with your dad after
Oh
that?
yeah, yep, yep. We went back and trapped again, and I remember I don't remember a lot of what he caught those years, but I do remember even back then when was not real common around where I grew up in Minnesota. So it was to see that gray fox up close.
And as a kid, like, was your dad trapping the short line? Because the 80s, that was kind of around the second fur boom. Was it the reason because there was an abundance of fur and it was actually worth something at the time, or was it just a hobby that was passed down to him too?
It was more of a hobby. He trapped a little bit, because it was worth some money. I remember him picking up were just roadkill. But it was more
Yeah.
of just kind of a hobby to be around the farm. At that time, we lived in a small town nearby, so it was a way for us to get back out to the farm where they live now and where I grew up, and kind of see that stuff and kind of spend the time on the line. And I kind of did the same thing with my kids, because trapping is a great activity for kids because they don't have to be quiet. They don't have to get up real early. It's not like going and sitting in a deer stand where you got to be quiet for hours. You can kind of go out and see things. So, I really enjoyed that. And then he kind of got out of it, as the fur market fell, and most people did at that time. And but yeah, I probably wouldn't be doing it today if I hadn't started.
That's awesome. I mean, I know you do that with your kids. I do it with my kids. I hope it sticks. But from that point where your dad hung up his, footholds or his conibears, snares, whatever he was using, fur booms over, what was the gap like between when he stopped really focusing on a trap line and when you, maybe as an adult or a young adult, picked it back up on your own?
So it was quite a while. So I moved to a small town in North Dakota, and I was really into bow hunting, and I still love bow hunting, but it was kind of my focus for most of my 20s, was bow hunting. And then there'd be a couple of years when I would shoot a deer. Season runs long in North Dakota, September through January with a bow, but we can only shoot one deer. So I would shoot a deer in September, and all of a sudden the fall would kind of look sparse. And I'd waterfowl hunt and stuff, but it didn't really have that real burn. So at about 2014, I think it was, I bought a couple dog-proof traps, and I figured I had 2 daughters at the time; they were pretty young. That it would be a fun way to kind of go out and catch some fur, and we did. We caught two raccoon that year, and I hadn't skinned fur in a long time, and I kind of butchered them, and then I had a friend of mine that had moved to North Dakota from Michigan,
Hmm.
and he was a head trap during the boom in the 80s, and he had some raccoons that at the time were worth very little, and he offered to give them to me so I could learn how to tan. So
Hmm.
that winter I bought some tanning stuff, and I learned how to tan. And And after that, I kind of figured if I could use the fur, I was going to try. And the beauty of fur is you don't have to draw a tag. You don't have to wait for a 1 week out of the season. I mean, I started trapping in mid-October through January, in most years, unless we get a ton of snow. But it's 3-4 months of always having something to look forward to nearly every morning.
That's amazing. And I want to poke on family a little bit too, because I'm a big interest here. You talked a little bit about it being a great thing for kids because you don't have to be quiet when you're making sets per se. Um, but when you took your daughters after buying those dog proof traps and you had the raccoons, do you remember what their reaction was? Was it like fear? Was it excitement? Was it, where were they on the spectrum of
Yeah,
kids
yeah. So they
reacting
were,
with?
yeah, I'm trying to remember. They were quite young, so they were super excited. It was like, holy smokes, this is the
Mm,
coolest thing ever. And then a couple years later, they were with me again, and my middle daughter then, because now I had a youngest, she had a little bit of a struggle with the dispatch.
mm,
My oldest was excited. My youngest was excited, but the middle ones. So we kind of sat in it. I remember it like yesterday. It was dark yet because I was gonna drop them off at daycare on the way into work, and we kind of sat down there and talked a little bit about. And we talked about how we see raccoons smushed on the road, and we see raccoons that die of distemper. That the fact that we're killing it, which is tough. And I told her that that's always the hardest thing, trapper or a hunter or fisherman, anything. And the fact that even though we're doing that, we're going to utilize them. And we the area we live in is a farming area, so resource use is common, but most people don't think of fur or fur bearing animals as renewable resources. And she, and actually it's funny, she's the only daughter of mine so far that's actually shot a deer. The one that had the most difficult with the dispatch was the only one so far that has shot a deer. So it was kind of a nice learning experience. And to do that together. And too often you see kids that aren't exposed to that kind of take it for granted or don't really understand the how important it is to really kill another animal. And I remember sitting there with her and telling her that wreck, or a day ago, was out looking for food, was just living its life, and now we have it. And kind of how big of a thing that really is to do that.
I think that's great advice, and is advice that I'm asking because my daughter's been on my trap line with me. She hasn't been around for any dispatching. She's only been on my water line where I leverage conibears. So yeah, I'm curious to learn. So it's interesting, and I
Yep.
think talking it through and framing it in a way like you did is a beautiful way to do that and bring your kids, boys, girls, whomever, kind of along for the journey. And it seems like it worked well.
Yep. Yep. And it's, and honestly, right now my two oldest are teenagers, they're into sports and whatnot. Is it gonna stick when they get older? I don't know. But I guess for me, even if it doesn't stick and all three of them don't want to hunt or trap, they understand it. And when it comes down to it, we're a minority, a very small minority. And having people understand what we do, even if they don't do it, I think is the most critical piece that there is nowadays. And with my day job, I do a lot of, in the wintertime, a lot of outreach and education. And one of my favorite things to talk about is I bring in a bunch of pelts, a bunch of, native animals to our area. And I go into, urban cities in Fargo, North Dakota is not Chicago, of course, but it's still an urban. And, and seeing those kids where a lot of times they'll first kind of, that's a dead animal. And at the end, they're taking pictures with their phones, they're petting it, they're asking me where they can see these animals. And you know and I always figure there's probably not one kid in that class that's going to trap, but they're going to understand why we trap. And not think that it's this cruel thing that they may see on YouTube or something. So I think that's the most important thing as trappers we can do is educate people and let them understand why we do what we do, and not just because we're out there trying to kill a bunch of animals. But it's kind of an important link in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I fully agree. And, obviously this is a thread we pull a lot on this show. But I was actually speaking with somebody else who does a lot of outreach and will go talk to kids. And uh, he said he took a box of scrap fur to, I think his kids like education day and they talked about fur trapping. He said same thing, initial aversion followed by enthrallment, and every piece of that
Hmm.
scrap fur kids were trading and fighting over, and they thought it was the coolest thing.
That's right. That's right.
So
That's the best way to get a kid hooked is give them a little piece of fur.
I mean, that got me hooked too. I think my trapper's ed course, they had some scrap fur,
Hmm.
and I was just like a kid. I was like, well, this is awesome. I can use this for something. I don't know, a tab or a
Yeah.
fly. So pretty cool.
Right.
Now, on the thread of education, you and I have a commonality in that we're both authors and we both have put ourselves in a position to make stories of our adventures, you can call them that, or learnings in the outdoors into prose, into writing, whether that be books, publications. And you have several books now, one that just came out. So, congratulations. But
Thank you.
what was the motivation? What was the motivation behind you putting your stories into writing?
So that's a good question. So, I grew up I always say I grew up, my formative years kind of before the internet or when the internet was in its infancy. And I remember both getting magazines in the mail, and or going to the local gas station and buying them off the newsstand. And my mom worked at a grocery store her whole career. And at that time they had a newsstand. So she would bring home any sort of hunting magazine that there was. And my dad also was in the old out where you could buy books pretty cheap. So he has a pile of them. I have them now because he doesn't read them anymore. But and I remember just devouring those magazines, just devouring. Like I'd get that new bow hunter magazine, and by the time the next one came out, it was dog eared, and I had read everything about it. Most kids were had Viking football players were their heroes, or Minnesota Twins players. My hero was Chuck Adams and Bob Gilsvik. Those are the guys that I thought were were kind of the cream of the crop. And so I always loved, and I still get a ton of magazines. And about, I want to say, I think it was 2015, I was coming back from a bear hunt in Ontario in the fall, and I stopped at a gas station. I picked up an issue of Fur Fish and Game, and I hadn't read that magazine in years. And I picked it up, and I got when I got home, and I read it, and I was kind of looking at it, going, some of these stories aren't superlative pro. Maybe I'm going to give it a shot. So I went on the internet, I found the editor's name, and I sent him a couple ideas, and he actually ended up liking an idea, and I sent him, and it was like, holy smokes, I'm getting a check in the mail for this story. And so the first couple of year, I didn't have ideas, and then it kind of just snowballed, and I started thinking like, there's a lot of stuff I can talk about. And what kind of always got my goat a little bit when you're reading outdoor writing is when the author acts like they're superior. Like only they can shoot that 200-inch deer, only they can catch 400 fox a year. And I always look at it as I want a reader to read it and go, if this knucklehead can do it, anybody can do it. And a lot of my stories are kind of that way. And this is all the things I did wrong. And I still think about it. I mean, I remember last year getting him up in my tree stand, and as I'm getting up there, I put my bow um, tow rope up there, and it falls off and goes to the ground. And I'm sitting there going like, "Are you serious? Like, I don't think all these good bow hunters drop their tow rope on the ground. I crawl back down and get it, and I think it's just kind of, I like people to read it and go, if the guy can do it, I can do it, and kind of expose people to the wildness around their home. They might not be able to go trap a wolverine in the Northwest Territory, but you can catch a raccoon, or you might not be able to tail, but you can shoot a doe. And just kind of making it more about the result. And I it's still, and I've had, I don't know, at last count 120 some articles published. I still love seeing it in print. It's still like the first time. So I it's a very enjoyable way to kind of share the outdoors with people beyond just myself or my family.
And I think a lot of listeners, whether they know it or not, have probably read an article of yours along the way, whether it's through Fur Fish and Game or some of the other outlets. So, folks can think back and, oh man, was that a story Jeffrey wrote? But what about books too? So you've written tons of articles. There is a big jump
Hmm.
And I know from personal experience between writing articles, which is where I started too, and then going to full length books. What was the first book you wrote, and what was the motivator to go from a
So
3,000 word article about your time in the woods to something more lengthy?
right. So it's funny. The first book I wrote was actually a collection of fictional short stories, and I kind of wrote it just on a lark. Um, and I also sudden started having them pile up, and I thought, maybe I can publish this. And the beauty of publishing nowadays is there still is traditional publishing. You get an agent, you get a publisher, that whole works, and that's the way most people do it. But there is independent publishing, and 20 years ago it was called self-publishing, and you paid to have your book published. And now independent publishing, you can do that as print on demand. Now, is it going to have the because you have to do your own promotion and stuff, but it does make it a little easier. So I did that first one, and I'll be honest with you, fiction is way more difficult than nonfiction. Fiction, you're trying to create something. Nonfiction, you're writing about something that already happened. It's a lot easier. So fiction was tough. And then the second book I did, basically a collection of magazine articles, 100th published article, and I thought this is kind of a nice milestone. So I went through and selected articles on fishing, trapping, hunting, kind of the whole works. And then the book was, especially my early art, I didn't realize there was, I think, 30, so I just cut down 8 with the complete, the 3,100 words. I had quite a few stories that by the time it gets to the editor, I've cut it down a bit. But for that book, I was able to put them in there as the length I wanted to. And that was kind of, and I'm sure you've found the same thing, is that, I know when my second book was published, people asked me, are you going to quit your job now? And I said, no. It, it, you certainly are not writing a book to make $1 million. It's more of a passion project. And for everyone Stephen King, there's a million people that maybe pay their electrical bill with their royalty check. Yeah, yeah. I mean, but it was it is I have my writing mentors is out of upstate New York. His name is Joel Spring, and he's written some of the greatest outdoor books I've ever read. Um, and he has told me that when I first started writing, he said magazines are nice because you write them, you get your check, you see it published. But he said in 20 years, most people have thrown magazines away. Where a book is tangible. That book is going to stick around for who knows how long. What I mean? And you can crack that book and smell it and feel it, and it definitely is nice having that book in your hands. So, and I've done some online magazine writing and stuff, and it's not nearly as satisfying to see it on a screen. It's nice to have it in that book and smell the ink in the paper, and it's pretty fulfilling. So for the books, to be honest, is kind of more of a passion project. And I enjoy doing it, and just to have anybody read it is fulfilling. So
Yeah, I mean, I agree on all the points, but to yours and the self publishing, the independent publishing, you have to market yourself. So let's start there. What are the names of your books? And you just had one come out this last Tuesday. What are they? Quick, what are the names? What are they about? And where can people find them?
yep. So the first one is called Klossberg, North Dakota, Klasberg, and that's the fictional short story collection. So basically, what I did is I kind of did a poor impression of like Stephen King's Castle Rock. I created a fictional city, semi quasi fictional from where I'm at, and kind of wrote about that. The middle one is called Forever Towards the Sunrise, and that one is a collection of hunting, fishing, and trapping stories. And then my newest one is called Our Bend in the River, and that one is more about modern homesteading, gardening, growing fruits, kind of more rural living stuff. There is some stories on hunting and trapping in there, but it's more about kind of living a rural life. So in the fall of 2017, I have 500 people out to a 5-acre farmstead on a river, and the stories are kind of from that point, and creating wild and planting a garden and fruit, and they're all kind of different. Each book, I think, it attracts a little bit different audience, and they're all available from Amazon, or my Facebook page is called Cottonwood Bend Farm, and you can also get them from there directly from me.
Awesome. And, talking about the learnings, you mentioned that first, I'm going to call it a season where you caught two raccoons, you skinned them mediocrely, and then you bought some tanning solution. Let's talk about tanning. What was that experience like of tanning? And to what point did you get, like, how many seasons did it take of attempting before you are at where you're at now, where you're actually selling fur, tan fur, as different goods? What was that journey like?
So I bought a product called True Bond 1000B, it's called. It has very good instructions, and I was able. The hardest part for me to get the skin from the dried skin to get it hydrated enough. So out of those first six raccoon, like two of them came out flawlessly, two of them came out as stiff as a board, and two of them came out pretty mediocre. So those few raccoon kind of helped me learn as I went forward, and it's all chemistry, and um, I didn't do great in chemistry in college, so I really had to kind of practice, and you've got to stick to the pHs, and I mean you really have to keep everything right, or else it's going to slip, or it's going to. But I've kind of found that there's some furs that are really easy to tan, like rabbit is easy, muskrat's easy, canines are easy, and then you get like raccoon and fisher that are not super hard, but you don't get them quite as good as a tannery tan. And then there's ones like badger and otter and beaver that without the proper tools, you'll never get tan. So I end up sending those off to tanneries, and then I do the rest myself. Um, and then I always wanted to make a hat, so I made myself a hat. I still wear it. It I always try to do, if I'm going to do a new, either a new mitten style or something new, I always make the first one for myself or for the kids or for Heather, to make sure that it actually works. um so like the mittens were the biggest learning curve, because mittens, your hand has a lot of movement, and you can pop seams, and so I had to learn how to make sure that the seams didn't pop, and so if somebody purchased it, they were getting something that was going to last. And well, fur is a multi multi-generational product. If you there's no reason your kid couldn't wear it when they're your age. I mean, it's an heirloom product, and it's not a fake fur made out of petroleum. So I always try to make them to make sure that they're going to last, as long as that person wants it to last. And then the beauty of fur is if they don't want it anymore, they can throw it away and it decomposes. It doesn't have to go to a landfill. It's the ultimate green renewable resource.
I love that. That's actually a great plug for fur, and I'm going to steal that from you. Um, when you did tan your first fur to make your hat, did you have a sewing background, or was that also something you had to learn along the way too?
The last time I had sewed prior was in seventh grade. I made a pair of boxer shorts in a home ec class. So I had to learn everything, and there was a definite learning curve. It's all, and I do all hand sewing, so it
Mm.
it took a little bit. It was funny because I actually had brain tanned a few deer skins, and I made a jacket, and I still have the jacket. It's 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 pretty bad, but that kind of got me to understand the stitch, and how to, what the right needles are, and the and even like cutting the fur, you can't cut with the scissors. If you cut it with the scissors, it looks like a bad haircut. But if I did, it would look like a bad haircut. So even from cutting the fur, sewing to the whole works is really something I had to learn. And there's a lot of books and great YouTube videos, but it definitely was a learning curve. And everyone got a little bit better. And it was funny. Earlier this winter, a person that had bought one of my first hats actually had one stitch come out. So he brought it in and I fixed it. And I was looking at it, and it's a fine hat, but you look at the ones I make now and it's like, man, I've really come a long ways. And it's just that experience of doing it. And it's nice because I do most of them in the winter time. And in North Dakota, the winters are long and snowy. And if I'm sitting or sewing and watching TV. So I figure the sewing is kind of what necessarily works for me might not work for somebody else. But It's just, and the nice thing is like raccoon, I feel like every fur is worthy, but if you do a bad one, you can always cut the seams, try it again, or, give it to your kid that's going to end up getting it all. Practice makes perfect.
At what point in that journey did you decide I could sell these?
So I had a couple local friends of mine that had seen me wearing that, my first hat, and said, "Could you make me one of those?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And the first year I made two hats. I made one for a friend of mine, or both for friends, so two hats. And the next year I had a little bit more fur, and I made a little bit more, and before I knew it, I was getting people that were contacting me or calling me that I had never met anything, and asking for hat. I mean, I have one guy from North Dakota that I would bet has bought half a dozen hats and half a dozen pair of mittens from me. Every year he buys a couple and he gives them as gifts and stuff. And so, it's kind of crazy. And again, Fargo, which is a large town around here, it's not but if I'm wearing my skunk mittens or my beaver hat, I bet you every store I go to, somebody stops me and asks me about it. I've got to the point where I just carry business cards and hand them out because people will ask about it. And I've never had a bad reaction. All I've had is, is that real, or where do I get that, or, that kind of thing. So it's, real fur stands out in a crowd. And, and it's funny now, if we go to a thrift store, there's fur coats, and be looking at them, and you'll see the fake fur, and I'll always tell the kids, or I'll tell Heather, like, take a look at it, and they can see instantly what's real and what's fake. And so that real fur really sticks out. And I think a lot of people like it. So here in eastern North Dakota, we have a very small but thriving wine scene, right? So there's local vineyards that make their wine. And we always kind of talk with the owners, like, I can go to a liquor store and buy a $4 bottle of wine, and it's made who knows where. Or I can pay $20 and buy a bottle of wine that has this cool little story on the side, and the vineyard owners, you've been there, and you're paying a little bit more for that story. And that's kind of where I figure with the fur is so when somebody buys a hat, they get a little type note of where the animal was caught, and kind of a short little story on it, so they know that that animal was, directly from the river to the tannery to them. And it's kind of a value added product. So um that's kind of the fun thing, is the every buyer gets a little bit of a story on that piece. And like I said, I would say probably 40 to 50% of the people that buy it are repeat buyers. So run out of fur long before I run out of people that want to buy it.
That story element's really cool. I would have never have thought of that, to say, hey, this insert critter was caught here ethically. I bet that does
Yep.
go a long way in making someone satisfied with the purchase of fur.
And it's funny. So I had a friend of mine, actually, she owns a winery, and I traded her a pair of muskrat mittens for a case of wine. And she posted it on her Facebook page. And, of course, one of the comments, because she had said, my friend Jeff trapped these sustainably and ethically. And one of the first comments was, "There's no such thing as sustainable trapping. It's cruel, blah, blah, blah." And I was able to at least respond to that, and, talk about, the trapping methods, and a little bit about the, humaneness studies and whatnot, and say that there is ethical and legal, sustainable trapping, and kind of use that as a little bit of education. Now, did that person come out and buy fur for me? No, but hopefully they at least were able to have a little bit. Well, maybe it isn't as cruel as the 1980s, pictures of the little fox in the huge trap. That's kind of what I feel we're fighting a lot against, is a lot of that early anti-first sentiment with the photos. And even now I have hunters at me, well, doesn't it break the animal's legs? And I say, if trap breaks the animal's legs, I've failed, because
Mhm.
it should not, it should, it hold as a restraint it, as much as they probably should. So having that story kind of really helps the buyer feel comfortable about what they're purchasing.
I love it. And, in that journey, one of the questions I always love to ask, so it's twofold. What's the biggest mistake you've ever made on your trap line? And then I also want to know the biggest mistake you've ever made in the fur shed or tanning.
So the biggest mistake on the trap line was probably in my early days of beaver trapping was having really, really good spots to trap and making really, really poor sets and come day and having my traps tipped over or at the end of the drowning cable empty and realizing that I have to wait till next year to trap that spot again because I've ruined it. So, some of those early ones where when you come and check the trap and then you look and say, why did I put it here? So there isn't any like real big like one moment, but those first few years of really making some mistakes that when you look back are like, man, I really messed up opportunities to catch. And a lot of it was beaver because beaver trapping for me was the biggest learning curve because you're around the river, it's cold, um, you know, it's a lot of work, and you go through a lot of work and you make a poor set and fail. That's not a good thing. In the first shed, so my buddy Mike is a late comer to trapping. He just started trapping a couple of years ago, and he jumped in feet first. And 2 years ago, he snared a fox, a real pretty pale North Dakota fox, and he threw it in his freezer, and he brought it out to me. Actually, the next fall, he got it to me, and he had thought it. So I threw it up on the gambrel and started skinning, and got down to about its waist, and I started pulling hard like you normally do, and I pulled so hard that I tore it in half.
Mhm.
And I'm sitting there going, this is his first fox, and I just ripped it in half. So I ended up, sewing it, and he was standing there, and he kind of had his mouth open, like, "Are you kidding me?" But I guess that was a good, thing of if you can sew, you can fix anything. But I felt pretty awful because this was his first fox, and I mean, I just did it. I was holding the back half in my hands, going, "Oh my gosh, I just tore that thing up." So yeah, and so I always tell new trappers like take your time. You're not in a hurry, and don't feel like you have to beat the clock, because if you do, you're gonna rip it. And sometimes people will bring me a coyote or something that they want tan, and they want the paws on it. And the same thing with the paws. If you're hurrying on the paws, you're gonna ruin it, and you can't sew the paws up once you cut them up. So it's something you just got to take your time and do it right, because even a coyote, most coyotes that I do for people are guys that shot their first one or whatever, so they don't want it damaged. I want to give them a good piece. Where for me, if I do a little bit of a bad job on a raccoon, I can sew it up and throw it in the pile. But it's just, I guess at the end of the day, it's always slow and steady, because every time I've tried to rush anything in life, I fail.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty sage advice for anything, but especially in the fur shed and on the trap line. Now, for somebody who might be trapping curious, right? Somebody who is heard about trapping, is interested in the sustainable fur aspect of it. What's the one piece of advice you would give to them as they start out?
My biggest piece of advice is always to find a mentor. You know, Trapping can be done poorly. And if you're out there not knowing what you're doing, you can cause some issues. So always find a mentor. And I found, maybe back during the fur boom, people were pretty tight-lipped. They were making money on it. They weren't going to tell a competitor how to catch something. Nowadays nobody's making money on it. So reach out to somebody in your community and find a mentor to take you out, because first of all, curve, in half, and you're going to do it right. And I had some mentors when I got back into it. My buddy Pat from Michigan was my mentor, and he was able to open my eyes. And then my neighbor, actually, here where I live, his name is Mark, and I was trapping beaver on his spot on his land one time, and I had caught one. I was all proud of myself, and he came out and he goes, "That wasn't a very good set." And then he explained to me exactly what a good set was, and that cut probably in 10 minutes. So, having mentors and realizing that no matter how good you are, never the best. That was one thing I learned in sports, that if you're the best player on your team, there's a player on a team better than you. And that's the same way with the outdoors. And the beauty of the outdoors is we're not competing. We're not competing it shouldn't be a competition. So find that person that knows more than you and learn from them. That's the same thing I did with bow hunting is, surround yourself with people that know more than you, and you're going to learn, and be open to learning, because maybe you think this is the greatest set in the world, and then you learn another one and you're like, well, maybe this one's even better. So, find a mentor and listen to them. That's my biggest point of advice.
And it's a piece of advice that comes up a lot. Find a mentor, but I haven't asked
Yeah.
this question of anybody. If you're new, you haven't been around trapping, you haven't been around hunting, how would you suggest someone go about finding a mentor in their local area? What's the best avenue for that?
Right. So, you know, and I guess I'm coming at this from a small town perspective, but generally in small towns, who it's that's the walleye guy, or that's the trapping guy, or that's the bow hunter, or and what's different about when you and I were young and now is we have social media and we have the internet, we have all this stuff. And like for instance, North Dakota has a fur trapping Facebook page. So that'd be easy if you were a new trapper to go on there and say, hey, I live in Fargo, anybody want to take me out? Or another really good, join your state's trapping, because you can almost always find somebody in your area in those local organizations that can help you. Or even quite honestly, if you go to your local sports, one of our big sporting goods stores here is Shields. They have a trapping section. If you're standing in that trapping section and there's somebody else there, ask them, say, hey, what are you doing, what do you trap, that kind of thing. And it's a little uncomfortable, but quite honestly, I, my one of my trapping mentors, Pat, I actually met him one evening. We were coming out of the woods on a public hunting area for deer, and usually when you go to a public spot and you see a truck parked there, you're like, son of a gun, this guy's, is he on my spot or whatever. But we ended up chatting, and we ended up in that chance meeting kind of becoming lifelong friends. So, just kind of keeping your eye open. And like I said, I always say join your state national trapping organization, because not only can you, but they are the ones that are helping to protect us no matter where you are. Luckily in a state like North Dakota, we have there's a lot of support for trapping, but there's a lot of states that there isn't, and having that support is huge. And like I said, I remember reading one time a guy was talking about using a conibear, like a foothold, laying it on the ground so the animal steps in it. If you're a newbie, you might think that's acceptable. Well, a mentor is going to say, no, 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 that's not the way that trap works. So, having that mentor there is huge.
Yeah, and shout out to Shields. We finally got our first one here in Idaho that opened 2 weeks ago. But what's interesting is they actually reached out to Idaho Fish and Game and had one of the trap instructors go and do a full trapper's education course for all of the employees at Shields. So at least every employee there has a baseline knowledge of trapping, which I thought was extremely cool.
And it is. And so, for instance, in North Dakota here, snaring laws especially are very state dependent. So when you go into the shields in here, and snares are labeled Michigan legal, Wisconsin legal, North Dakota legal. That way, if you're a new snarer, you don't just grab a pack of snares off the wall and walk away with it. So they, and that's important. I always talk about with my day job, when people talk about trees and they go to a big box store and buy an apple tree, and they call me the next year and say, well, it died. And I say, well, what variety was it? And it's some variety that is zone, 5 specific, and we're in zone 4. And I said, well, the big box stores don't care, right? They're just selling a tree. But when it comes to trapping gear, you can't be quite that flippant. You got to have the gear that's legal there. So it's nice to hear and like I said, Shields is good at that, in kind of having the things labeled to make sure that the laws are being followed. Across the river in Minnesota, the snaring laws are different, and I'm sure in Idaho they're different than they are here. So you've got to really be aware of what you're putting in the field, based on where you're at, and not just because you bought it.
And, like you said, it's also making it more accessible. So I think that's a great thing. Like it can be a bit of a challenge to get over the learning curve of just learning how to get licensed to trap in your own state. So then when you do have a big box store, and maybe you want to go to a mom and pop one down the line, whatever your case is, or online, but now there's opportunity for folks in Idaho or North Dakota to go and explore and like you said, be kind of guided too by them, both from experience and just in the legality of it, which is a big bear, as you mentioned.
And like you said, it is important. I like to buy, my stuff from a wide variety of vendors, but it is nice to be able to go to a big box store, making it more accessible to beginners than if you have to go on a website and get overwhelmed by 4,000 different kind of lures and all that stuff. So those big box stores, and I'm young enough that I remember the hardware store had trapping stuff and hunting stuff, and that's not quite the way it is anymore, but there opportunities for new people to find that gear locally.
Yeah. Now, my next question is going to ask you to look into like your magic 8 ball, or, rub your little lantern with a genie in it. What do you see as the future of trapping?
So I see the future of trapping as kind of a couple directions. I mean, there's always going to be your professional damage trappers, for beaver and coyotes and stuff, and people make a living at it. you know that's always going to be, because we're always going to have issues, especially in the east and even in the midwest and the west, as the cities grow, and we're impacting more and more wildlife habitat. um, I do feel like the other side of it is going to be a lot of kind of hobbyist trappers, and I guess I don't like the word hobbyist, but trappers that enjoy trapping raccoon, and they might catch 100 in a year, and they just enjoy doing it. I don't really see the days of the long liner coming back. You hear those stories about guys that would take a month off of work and pay for a pickup. I don't think that's going to happen again. I just don't think that the fur demand is going to be that huge. I think there's still a demand for fur, but it's not the way it was. You don't see anybody wearing fur coats anymore. It's going to be more of the cottage industry. And I think a lot of it is going to be people that want to experience more in the outdoors and are going to kind of dabble. So, for instance, here in North Dakota, which is going to be surprising, but we have a fisher season, and our fisher season is 7 days long, and you can catch one fisher a year. And I would say that I probably skin a quarter of the fishers that are caught in North Dakota, because people that go after them have no experience trapping, but have seen a fisher and they want to catch it, and they catch it and they call me and say, "What do I do with it?" So they bring it over and I skin it for them and tell them how to register it and stuff. But that's of, I want to catch a fisher, and they go and catch it, and maybe now next year they try to catch a raccoon or two. But they're gonna throw caution in the wind and go try to catch 5,000 raccoon next year. It's kind of more of a hobby. Or people that bought of two people bought a place in the country and they have chickens, and a fox gets their chicken, try to catch the fox, and they catch it and think, well, this is kind of cool. So they do a little more fox trapping or something. So I guess in the future, I see trapping, and I think it's important as trappers to, I know we always talk about it's good to prevent disease and overpopulation and stuff, but that always to me sounds a little academic. You're not convincing anybody by saying that, we're doing this because we want to prevent overpopulation. I think it's more of being in touch with the land. And as the year go on, it's so easy to be completely enclosed in a bubble and work from home and have your groceries delivered and really not feel kind of the earth's patterns and movements. And I think people, non-trappers, respect the fact that we're doing this because we enjoy the outdoors and we want to be outside. And um, it's funny, last week, and my buddy Mike and I, it was his first time beaver trapping, and we had set a pretty long line. We had to hike a lot. And we caught two beavers, and I was kind of bummed. The last few sets we look at and they're empty. And he goes, "But hey, Jeff," he goes, "it's a nice morning, isn't it?" And I said, "You're right. It is a nice morning. Like, that's why we're out here." And, one or two more beaver wasn't going to make that day any better. So, just kind of using it as an all-encompassing way to enjoy outdoors. And that's kind of the future. And I think as consumptive users of the outdoors, whether we're hunters or fishermen or trappers, have a pretty darn solid reason on why we do what we do, because less and less in touch with nature. And making people understand why we do what we do, and I always talk about, I wonder how many hunters would get a license if before they got that license, they'd have to go out in the woods and identify 10 tree and shrub species and 10 grass species. And I'm a little afraid what that number would be because I think it'd be pretty low. And, you know, it, the outdoors is not just a place to go out and get a trophy. I always say if you want a trophy, go go golf or go bowling or something. It's more than just the act of killing your animal or catching your animal. And I do feel that's changing a little bit as people are becoming more and more aware of how important it is to interact with wildlife. I've had people use a camera, and I use a camera, and it's fun to take wildlife photos. But I'll be honest with you, it's not the same. It's not the same to snap a picture of a deer than it is to shoot a deer, and it's a lot heavier topic. But for our family, with the exception of a little bit of chicken, that we don't buy any meat from the grocery store. Everything we eat is something that we either caught, shot, or caught in the river. And I feel like it makes my kids a little more aware of what they're eating. They're less likely to throw away something when they know where it came from. And we all know that meat comes from
Mhm.
animals, but if you're not part of it, it doesn't really matter to you. It's just like vegetables. If they're out there digging potatoes in the heat, they're less likely to throw that potato away than if I just brought it from the grocery store. And I think that whole sphere of knowing where your food comes from, knowing where your clothes come from, knowing where the goods you use come from is really important because, like fake fur, fake fur is made out of petroleum, a non-renewable resource. So when we're going to argue about, you know, sustainability, fake fur is not a sustainable product. So, and I've had a few people really kind of have a light bulb pop and go, "Are you serious? That's a petroleum-based product?" And so it's just kind of, now that being said, obviously not everybody on earth could live the way that we live. There wouldn't be any wildlife left, right? That people have to live in cities and everything else. But for me to go to bed at night and feel good about my mark on the earth, I like, kind of living a little bit off the land. Now, obviously we still go to Costco and I still enjoy eating Cheez-Its and whatnot, but we try to do as much as you can. And there's people that live off grid and do really cool things. I don't think I could do that, but it's all about how we want to interact with the world. And that's kind of where I see trapping as part of it, is our interaction with the world. And it also was one of the few things on earth, I feel like, that the trappers 300 years ago didn't weren't much different than us. Similar techniques, and it's hard to picture anything 300 years ago being similar to it is now. And that's one of the I always kind of feel like it's a kind of cross the divide of the ages and kind of go back to, you know, being what it was like there, 200 years ago or something. So
Yeah, I always tell people that trapping is like the ultimate time machine or the closest thing to a time machine you can get, and uh, it's a blast.
yeah, yeah, and trapping has made me a better bow hunter for sure. Because when I'm bow hunting, I'm looking at a sphere of 20 to 30 yards. When I'm trapping, I'm looking at a sphere of an inch and a half, and it makes you really notice things that you didn't notice otherwise. So I've become a much better hunter as I've trapped more and more. And it just opens your eyes to how the land flows and how the wildlife flows on the land. And yeah, it definitely, if not for just that's made me enjoy trapping more, is because I don't want to say bow hunting is ever easy, but sometimes it seems like it's easier to shoot a deer with my bow than it is to catch a coyote in a foothold. So
Yeah, yeah, it's different levels of intensity and different levels of challenge, but it's challenge nonetheless. But kind of last, or not last question, but one of the questions I ask every guest, and what I'm curious about with all your time from childhood to adulthood, what's the craziest thing you've ever experienced in the woods?
good question. um I've never had anything super duper, but I guess I would probably say, and this is super duper crazy, but a few years ago in northern Wisconsin, we have a bow camp up there, and I had a doe and a buck tag, and I ended up shooting a doe And about 5 minutes later, a buck came trailing where she was, and I shot that buck as well. And that had never happened to me before, and probably will never happen again. It was that was probably the most, because when you go, especially when you're bow hunting, you go in the woods, you're not expecting something to happen, I guess you should say, because if you're expecting something to happen, you're going to be very disappointed. But that was probably the kind of the craziest thing that I've ever happened. And it's not super crazy. I haven't seen any ghosts or anything. Now, I'm a huge horror fan, so I still struggle at 41 years old walking in the dark woods. I've educated myself enough to know what a lot of those weird sounds are, but you know, you still flash back a little bit to some horror stuff. But I haven't seen anything really out of the ordinary. I'm always looking,
I
and I
think
guess
maybe
the
that's
only other thing I would say, and it wasn't so much the craziest thing, kind of the most, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I was gonna
I spent
say,
a lot of time in the woods, but yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time in the woods, but I haven't seen anything super crazy. But kind of funny, because sometimes the really memorable things, small moments. Oh, a couple of years sitting in a tree stand, and I had a pair of pileated woodpeckers go in the tree above me, a male and a female. And I'd never seen a male and a female pileated woodpecker together, and the way they interacted, the noises they made. I didn't see a single deer that night. But I remember going home thinking, like, that was something that I probably will never see again. So I kind of like to remember the little things, because quite honestly, the big things don't come around very often. But I would say one of the most probably memorable things I ever had was a few years ago. I drew a cow bison tag on an Indian reservation in South Dakota, and I was fortunate to get one with my bow. And I hunted with the indigenous guide, and you know, seeing those bison on the prairie, like, you talk about stepping back in time, like that was stepping back in time. It was absolutely incredible. And trying to picture our West covered in those animals, and then how close we were to losing the animals. And, it was a pretty amazing. That was the first time I've ever harvested an animal and on the ground looked at it and kind of felt like I really wasn't worthy of killing that animal. Like, it was, and, that was something I'll always remember. I've got the bison robe on our bed, so I see it every day. But, that was a pretty amazing experience.
yeah, that is amazing. That's one that I'd like to have one day. But the last question I like to ask is always a hypothetical. So, if you had to choose one of your passions to pursue the rest of your life and give up the other, which would it be? Would you like to give up or homesteading?
Oh, that would be that's a tough one, man. So honestly, I'd probably keep fur trapping, simply because it's easier to find access. It's easier to have licenses. I don't have to worry every year if I'm going to draw a raccoon tag. I can trap. I can find access places to do it. I would probably keep. I I know it's something that I could always do. I would be pretty miserable because I would hate to give up anything, but that would probably be the best. And we do eat some of the meat from the animals we harvest: beaver, raccoon, and muskrat. So even if I kept fur trapping, we'd still have food to eat. So I would probably say that it would be a very difficult. My life wouldn't be very fulfilled, though, if I had to give up the other one.
Yeah, that's a good answer, though. I mean, it does make a lot of sense in the logic behind it. But, Jeffrey, I want to first off thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me. I learned a ton. As we close this out, is there anywhere or anything you want to point people to? I know you have your books on Amazon. I'll put those in the show notes. Any way other people can get in
Mhm.
contact with you if they have questions about, the stuff you've done, or if they have questions or want you to be a mentor?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the easiest way, page or my Facebook page, either Cottonwood Bend Farm. I always say Cottonwood Bend Farm because I have a common last name. So Cottonwood Bend Farm is the easy one to find, and that's pretty much the easiest way. For better or worse, is there, and I use it not as much as a lot of other people, but I do use it. So that's the easiest way, and just happy to chat with people, or point them in the right direction or whatever, because like I said, I'm very passionate about our 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 sport of trapping, and if I can help anybody in any way, I mean that makes me feel good.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Jeffrey. And for folks listening, thank you. And tune in next time for another episode of the Okayest Trapper Podcast. We'll catch you next time.